Apparently I was always an abstract painter. My mother showed me paintings when I was in school, kindergarten, all the way through middle school, and apparently they were always abstract. I never tried to make a house and a pony and a face. They were always abstract. Abstraction for me as a young child, it kind of uncomplicated maybe my thinking a little bit. Abstraction was my way of reclaiming my own story and deciding how I was going to tell it.
Mark Bradford is an American artist born in 1961. He grew up in South Los Angeles with a single mother. About the time he was 30, he enrolled at Cal Arts, the great conceptual arts school, and decided to study abstract painting. Many contemporary artists do look back at the history of art. I think what is interesting is that Mark Bradford is really looking back into some grand traditions.
Mark Bradford's part of a generation of artists who are looking at more recent art forms, minimalism, abstract expressionism, post-minimalism, and trying to fill those forms and processes up with new ideas and new content. Abstract expressionism was a very significant movement, not only within American art, but within modern art. It starts to emerge during the Second World War, during the early and mid-1940s, but really flowers immediately after the war in the late 1940s and 1950s. Although the movement grew significantly in the 1950s, the leading proponents of abstract expressionism in the late 1940s would be Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, Mark Rothko, Clyfford Still, Barnett Newman, and probably Robert Motherwell. They really turned to an almost non-objective painting approach as a means to grapple with the grand themes of existence, life and death and chaos and complete annihilation, which was certainly a possibility during those years of the Second World War.
I find it interesting when you read about sort of 1950s America and you read about kind of what was going on. It was a precursor to civil rights, and Clyfford Still and so many of the people in the mid-50s had to be aware of what was going on outside of their studio doors. I think that history had decided something and kind of separated the art world from basically the civil rights movement. And then you discover people, other artists, abstract painters, Norman Lewis, Sam Gilliam, Jack Whitten, who sort of political agendas were very much tied to their work. So is it because they had to be tied to the work because they were African Americans, or is it because we kind of did not put ABEX in a full context? And so I just thought, let's make it a little more complicated in 2000 and whenever I started. Let's make abstract painting and let's imbue it with policy and political and gender and race and sexuality and all the stuff. Let's make the context full.
I think the great irony, and I think Mark Bradford has spoken about this, is in fact that the 1950s, when the movement really flowers, we see some very specific examples of the rising civil rights movement. Why is a movement dealing with ideas in an abstract term when the figure and content was so much a part of everyday life?
Mark Bradford uses the term social abstraction to describe his work. And what this really means is that he is an abstract painter who has allowed social and political content to inform his work. He says it clings around the edges. You see a lot of the artist's hand, a lot of activity. You can tell that the canvas has been torn or gouged. And in part, this is the artist's reaction to certain political situations.
I was more drawn to Clyfford Still because of the group, he was the roughest one, you know, barked, and he was just rougher. So maybe I like that because I'm a little rough too. So I probably maybe was attracted to him because he was a little rougher around not as pretty, jagged, the edges a little more jagged.
I don't know that it's always apparent to viewers of the abstract expressionist paintings that it's the paint itself that's communicating so strongly. So each of the major figures and their work is really an example of how they dealt with paint, and I think to a certain extent what their individual personalities were. So the way we read a Jackson Pollock and his poured and drip method, or the very thin glazes or washes that Mark Rothko used, are very much an important part of how we receive those overall images. images. And certainly the case of Clyfford Still, who used a palette knife and trowels to spread his handmade paint over the surface, is a huge determinant in how we receive those paintings today.
You really saw his hand and you saw the struggle. And they're ominous. Clyfford Still, there's an ominous feeling that he has in his work, oftentimes these large-scale, massively black paintings. And I did like the fact that he actually would grind up his own materials, his own paint and pigments. And I thought that was interesting because basically I make my own pigments too out of paper. I use a painting vocabulary, I just don't use paint. For shade, it was really keeping it minimal. I did reduce down my palette to one single color, which was this black inky paper that I've been using probably for 20 years now. So that was a limiting of the palette, which is very, Clyfford Still the same way, it's kind of limiting of the palette. But black is it's like Voldemort. It will cause you to fail. It is the most difficult color to work with. But yet, for me, it's the most satisfying. It has that depth to it. It has like fear and possibility for me.
Mark Bradford's engagement with socio-political situations, and in association with Clyfford Still, it recasts how we understand abstract expressionism. Both of these artists use the color black in terms of content and technique, but for Bradford, it's different. For Bradford, the use of black has implications of race.
What is interesting is that we are setting up an interesting conversation between things that really don't look like they should go together. We should allow ourselves to put things together that to the mind's eye don't look racially like they go together, generationally go together, styles go together. That's interesting to me because what comes out of that is a conversation, a rethinking, a remapping. We are presenting potential for a conversation. That's all we're doing right now. We don't have the answers. And for me as an artist, I am much more interested in questions than answers. Shade is simply putting questions into the public domain.